They will not only not have, they will not purchase, develop in any way, in any way, shape, or form a nuclear weapon. They will not have a nuclear weapon.
Something changed in Washington over the weekend. After 13 nights of intensified American strikes against Iran, President Donald Trump suddenly ordered a pause. The bombs stopped. Iran then indicated that it would also suspend its retaliatory attacks, as long as the United States did not resume its campaign. But this was not a peace agreement. No final deal had been signed. Iran's nuclear program remained unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz was still at the center of the crisis. American forces remained positioned across the region, and just as the fighting went quiet, another development was confirmed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was preparing to travel to Washington for an urgent meeting with Trump. Netanyahu's office confirmed that he would arrive in the United States on Monday and meet the president on Tuesday. The timing immediately raised one question. Did Trump pause the war before Netanyahu could persuade him to continue it? Before we examine what this meeting could mean for Iran, Israel, and the future of the Middle East, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because one decision inside the White House could change this story within hours. The official explanation from Washington was cautious. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz said Trump was giving diplomatic negotiations a little bit of room. He did not announce a breakthrough, identify a new agreement, or guarantee that the strikes were finished permanently. The message was simple. Diplomacy had been given another opportunity. But that opportunity came only after almost 2 weeks of bombing, pressure on American military resources, and growing questions about how much more the campaign could achieve. Iran responded with its own conditional position. A senior Iranian official said Tehran would continue its pause for as long as the United States maintained its own. In other words, neither side declared that the conflict was over. Each side was waiting to see whether the other would move first. That mattered because a ceasefire based only on matching restraint can collapse quickly. One missile launch, one strike against a ship, or one misunderstanding could return both countries to open confrontation. The silence was real, but it was fragile. And then Netanyahu's visit was confirmed. The Israeli Prime Minister was scheduled to leave for Washington on Monday, attend the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham, and meet Trump on Tuesday. On paper, this could look like a routine consultation between close allies, but almost nothing about the timing was routine. Trump had just paused American strikes. Iran was signaling temporary restraint. Diplomats were attempting to reopen negotiations, and Israel remained directly invested in preventing Iran from restoring its military and nuclear capabilities. Netanyahu was not coming to Washington during a stable moment. He was arriving at the exact moment Trump was deciding whether military pressure had achieved enough or whether the next phase should begin. That is why the title of this video says, "Trump stunned Netanyahu." There is no confirmed report that Netanyahu was personally shocked by the decision, but politically, Trump acted before their meeting and changed the situation Netanyahu would encounter when he entered the White House. Instead of discussing how to launch the next wave of attacks, the two leaders may now be discussing whether the current pause should survive. Instead of asking how much more force should be used, they may have to decide what Iran must offer in return for continued restraint. And instead of presenting one united military front, Trump and Netanyahu may need to reconcile two different priorities. Trump needs an outcome he can describe as a victory. Netanyahu needs guarantees that Iran cannot use diplomacy simply to rebuild. Those goals can overlap, but they are not automatically identical. The relationship between Trump and Netanyahu has always combined public warmth with a very clear struggle over influence. Earlier in July, Trump told Axios that Netanyahu knows who the boss is, referring to himself. He said Netanyahu had requested another White House meeting while Trump was weighing the next stage of the Iran conflict. That remark was not the language of two leaders presenting themselves as equals. It was Trump reminding the world that American military support gives the president enormous leverage over Israel's decisions. Trump has made similar comments before. In May, when reporters asked what he had told Netanyahu about Iran, Trump said the Israeli leader would do whatever Trump wanted him to do. The statement sounded humorous, but the political message was unmistakable. Trump sees himself as the final decision-maker when American power is involved. Netanyahu may influence him. Israel may provide intelligence, military coordination, and regional expertise. But if American aircraft, weapons, and personnel are being used, Trump expects the strategy to remain under his control. That dynamic is now being tested again. The United States paused after 13 nights of intensified bombing. Reports indicated that top military commanders had warned that the campaign was approaching the limits of its effectiveness. Concerns also existed about air defense interceptor stocks and the need to protect American forces and allies across the region. The administration publicly rejected suggestions that the United States was running out of weapons, but even a country with enormous military capacity must decide whether every additional strike creates enough strategic value to justify its cost. Military strength is not only about how many bombs remain, it is about whether the next bomb changes the situation. Trump now has to answer that question. If many of the most important targets have already been damaged, continued strikes could produce fewer military gains while creating greater political risk. They could provoke Iran into widening the conflict. They could place more American troops in danger. They could further disrupt shipping and energy markets, and they could turn a campaign Trump presented as decisive into the type of prolonged Middle Eastern war he repeatedly promised to avoid. Pausing the strikes gives him another option. He can argue that overwhelming force pushed Iran toward restraint, and that only he was strong enough to stop the attacks once an opportunity for diplomacy appeared. But Netanyahu may see the same pause differently. Israel has spent years warning that diplomatic pauses can give Iran time to reorganize, repair damaged facilities, and preserve the central elements of its nuclear and missile programs. In a statement issued on July 23rd, Netanyahu's office described joint American-Israeli military action as having weakened Iran and created new regional opportunities. The Israeli government continued to frame force as the foundation for any future peace. That does not prove Netanyahu will demand that Trump restart the bombing, but it explains why the coming meeting matters. The Israeli leader will want to know what the pause is supposed to achieve. What conditions has Washington communicated to Tehran? How much time will the United States give negotiations? What happens if Iran refuses inspections, enrichment restrictions, or maritime guarantees? And what would cause Trump to order the strikes to resume? Those questions will define whether the pause becomes the beginning of diplomacy or simply an intermission in the war. The Strait of Hormuz remains central to the entire crisis. It is one of the world's most important maritime routes, connecting Persian Gulf energy producers with global markets. Commercial traffic through the waterway had fallen sharply during the conflict, while attacks and threats created uncertainty for shipping companies and governments. Diplomatic efforts involving regional mediators were focused partly on restoring safer movement through the strait. For Trump, reopening that route would provide a visible and economically important result. It would allow him to say, American pressure protected global trade. For Iran, concessions involving shipping could provide a way to reduce immediate military pressure without publicly surrendering on every nuclear issue. But Netanyahu's priorities extend beyond shipping. Israel's central concern is not merely whether tankers can move safely. It is whether Iran emerges from the conflict capable of rebuilding its nuclear infrastructure, missile capacity, and regional network. A temporary maritime agreement may satisfy markets. It may not satisfy Israel. That creates the most important tension of Tuesday's meeting. Trump may be looking for an exit. Netanyahu may be looking for guarantees that the exit does not become an Iranian recovery plan. And both leaders will need to present the result as a victory. Trump cannot appear to have stopped too early. Netanyahu cannot appear unable to influence Washington. Iran cannot appear to have surrendered under bombing. That is why the language after the meeting could matter almost as much as the meeting itself. Watch whether Trump speaks about a deal, a final chance, or conditions. Watch whether Netanyahu emphasizes complete coordination or warns that Israel reserves the right to act independently. Watch whether either leader announces a deadline. And watch whether the White House describes the pause as diplomatic space or as a temporary military decision. Each phrase will reveal where the balance of power is moving. There is also another political pressure hanging over Trump. Congress has become increasingly divided over the president's war powers. The House of Representatives recently approved another measure challenging the continuation of hostilities without congressional authorization. Only 4 Republicans joined Democrats, meaning the overwhelming majority of Trump's party remained behind him. But the vote showed that opposition was no longer confined entirely to Democrats. Every additional week of war would create more votes about funding, authority, and strategy. A diplomatic pause gives Trump time not only in the Middle East but also in Washington. Netanyahu faces pressure of his own. He must demonstrate that Israel's sacrifices produced a more secure strategic environment. If the United States negotiates while Iran retains capabilities Israel considers unacceptable, Netanyahu could face accusations that military gains were traded away at the negotiating table. But openly challenging Trump would carry its own danger. Israel depends heavily on American military, diplomatic, and political support, and Trump has repeatedly made clear that he expects Netanyahu to recognize who holds the greater leverage. So Netanyahu will arrive in Washington needing to push for tougher conditions without making the disagreement look like a rupture. That is a difficult balance. He must influence Trump without appearing to command him. He must defend Israel's position without undermining the president's claim that the pause was his decision. And he must leave the White House with something he can present to Israelis as proof that Iran will not be allowed to recover. This is where the private meeting becomes more important than the public photographs. The cameras will show handshakes. The official statements will emphasize friendship. Both leaders will probably describe coordination as close. But the real question will be what happens after Netanyahu leaves. Do American strikes remain suspended? Does Iran agree to concrete negotiations? Is a deadline announced? Does Israel continue its own operations? And does Trump repeat that diplomacy now has a chance, or begin warning that his patience is almost finished? The answer may come quickly. Trump has a history of combining negotiations with public threats. In February, after another meeting with Netanyahu, Trump said talks with Iran should continue while warning that failure to reach an agreement would produce severe consequences. The pattern was already visible. Diplomacy offered with one hand, military pressure held in the other. The same pattern appears to be returning now, but under far more dangerous conditions. Earlier negotiations took place under the threat of war. These negotiations would take place after sustained combat. American and Iranian forces have already exchanged attacks. Lives have already been lost. Weapons have already been used. Each side now has a record it must defend and losses it must justify. That makes compromise more difficult because compromise can be portrayed as weakness by opponents on every side. Trump therefore needs Netanyahu's public support, or at least his public restraint. If Netanyahu leaves Washington and strongly criticizes the pause, the world will see division between the United States and Israel. Iran could interpret that division as an opportunity. Trump's political critics could argue that the administration has no unified strategy, and Israeli leaders could begin considering independent action. But if Netanyahu stands beside Trump and supports the diplomatic window, the pause gains credibility. It would show that Israel is willing to wait, at least temporarily, for Iran's response. That could become the central achievement of the meeting, not a peace agreement, not the end of the Iranian nuclear crisis, but a shared deadline and a common set of demands. There are three realistic paths from here. The first is a diplomatic breakthrough. Iran agrees to meaningful talks, maritime traffic begins to recover, and the United States extends the pause. Trump declares that military strength forced Tehran back to the table. Netanyahu supports the process after receiving security commitments and strict conditions. The second path is a controlled stalemate. The attacks remain paused, but no major agreement is reached. Diplomats continue talking while American and Israeli forces remain prepared. The region stays tense, but neither side chooses immediate escalation. The third path is the most dangerous. The negotiations fail. Iran resumes attacks or rejects American conditions. Trump concludes that the pause produced nothing. Israel demands renewed action. The bombing begins again, possibly with a wider target list and even greater consequences. Tuesday's meeting may determine which path becomes possible. Trump made the decision to pause before Netanyahu arrived. That gave the president control of the moment. He changed the facts before the Israeli leader entered the room. But Netanyahu's response could still shape what happens next. He can support the pause, demand stricter conditions, or warn that Israel will not wait indefinitely. And that is why this is not just another diplomatic visit. It is a test of who controls the next chapter of the Iran crisis. Trump has shown that he can start and stop American military action. Netanyahu now has to decide whether he can influence the conditions under which it remains stopped. Iran is watching both men. Congress is watching Trump. Israel is watching Netanyahu. And American military commanders are watching to see whether diplomacy reduces the pressure or merely delays the next order. For the moment, the skies are quieter. The attacks have paused. The meeting is confirmed, but nothing has truly been settled. Donald Trump has created a diplomatic window. Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to Washington to determine how wide that window should remain. And if the two leaders leave the White House with different answers, the next phase of this crisis may be even more dangerous than the last. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the statements following Tuesday's meeting could reveal whether this war is moving toward negotiation or preparing to begin again.